Good evening, everyone. My name is Inderbir Singh Riar, and I'm an associate professor in the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism at Carleton University. I'm delighted to welcome you to an evening of great creative spirit and architectural excellence. This year's forum series is made possible by the founding sponsor's commitment to situate architecture as means and matters of public concern. Speakers are arriving from all points of the globe. The Innovative Bureau for Architecture Research and Environment from Seoul, South Korea, speaks on November 27th at Dominion Chalmers Center. Don't miss, please, their experiments in turning seaweed into structure. The calendar continues in January with the Observer and Guardian newspaper architecture critic Rowan Moore, the Chilean office Del Rio Architects, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing Balakrishnan Rajagopal, Canadian Centre for Architecture Director of Collections Martine de Vletter, and Indigenous Australian architect Jack Gilmer. It's quite a lineup, and we very much hope to see you at each event. Tonight's lecture, like all others, occurs on traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. We also acknowledge that it's Remembrance Day, when we recall the guns that fell silent over a century ago to close what many thought was the war to end all wars. I'm reminded that the roots of my institution, Carleton University, grew in returning veterans who believed in 1945 that they had fought for a better world and came home to a nation about to embark on the great and enduring effort of building a welfare state. Universities became central to this mission of social progress. Early photographs of Carleton show soldiers still in uniform attending classes. Classes also with origins in a YMCA mission of helping folks hit hard by the Depression to get an education. Architecture played a leading role. Carleton, like other new universities, embraced progressive design. Buildings of style and probity defined the campus. Leading architects such as Hart Massey made lasting contributions. The result was what I call middle-class modernism. Today, the powers that be seem to have forgotten such noble purpose. Carleton erects one inspired structure after the next. The campus feels less and less like an education commons and looks more and more like a big pharma office park. Why are we surprised? We in Ontario, after all, no longer enjoy public education, but receive publicly assisted education. We thus get the architecture of neoliberalism. Buildings are reduced to Excel spreadsheets. The possibility of civic institutions engendering cultural meaning is thwarted by the mediocrities of design by consensus. Just look at Ottawa Public Library and Library and Archives Canada in their middling joint venture. It really shouldn't be this way. There is an alternative, and it exists just 2 hours away. Tonight's speakers remind us that buildings, above all civic buildings, can be well-made, rich in detail, and dedicated to social need. Hubert Pelletier and Yves de Fontenay founded their Montreal office in 2010. Early recognition as emerging talents soon gave way to awards of excellence, not for paper projects, but for attempts at defining the realms of culture, health, living, and indeed education. The work is not necessarily of public life, in that Pelletier de Fontenay are not urban designers per se. The work rather is of the public good, given the privilege accorded to the institution, the museum, the school, the laboratory, as means to shape better understandings of the world around us. I think here of Pelletier de Fontenay's modest but exemplary entry pavilion to the Montreal Botanical Garden, with its weathering steel giving impressions of organic life and eventual decay, commensurate to reckonings with controlled nature in city life. The result, like other Pelletier de Fontenay projects, uses rich materials and robust tectonics to lend senses of place that in turn exist as bulwark to the relentless march of undifferentiated urbanization. Architecture here strengthens the public trust by attending the needs of knowledge and of history, of science and of environment. Such honoring of architecture as a tool of collective edification becomes crucial in an age of rising political cynicism, marked by manufactured populist distrust in the very institutions and traditions of social democracy. With this spirit of architecture in the generous service of society, please join me in welcoming Hubert Pelletier and Yves de Fontenay to the podium.
Hello, I'm Hubert.
I'm Yves de Fontenay.
Thanks, Inderbeer, and thanks to the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism for this invitation. We are really happy to be there and have the opportunity, because every lecture is always a good opportunity to look back at our work and kind of retro-engineer some narrative into past work that have been done, often very intuitively or in the urgency of the creation. So it's always a good time to just take a pause and reflect and be forced to actually intellectualize a practice that is often really hands-on. So the angle we are proposing today is to look at some projects through the dialectics of the top-down and bottom-up polarity. We've been really interested lately in exploring this zone of conflict between concept and context. We realize that this is where we spend a lot of time in the design process, negotiating between the conceptual logics of the project and the messiness of the context and program. In other terms, negotiating the question of autonomy and heteronomy of architecture, or what has to bend to what when we discuss this polarity. So when do you lose the internal coherence of architecture because of the variables of the project, or inversely, when is the rigidity of the concept in the way of use or program? This is an important aspect of our understanding of architecture, that it is about objects with their own specific rules, with an inherent logic that holds them together, and that at the same time, architecture as a site, a context, is confronted with local condition and culture and needs to meet specific function. So it's logically abstract and physically real at the same time, and to bring these two aspects together, to reach this complexity of architecture is the task of every design process. What's interesting is where different architects put this cursor. Some are amazing conceptualists, some are amazing contextualists. We'll try to give you an idea of where we tend to situate our general body of work, and within different projects also, because there's a different lecture sometimes from project to project, and with a body of work, there's different reading that can emerge. So we need to go back to the very, very beginning of Pelletier de Fontenay. So back in 2010, before even having a single project, we wrote an application for a grant from the Quebec Arts Council, and we had we knew we wanted to start an office. We had no project, no client, no site, no context, and instead of doing like we were doing at school and build up, a fiction about all these things, we thought that it would be interesting to actually try to do architecture without all these variables, because we didn't have them. And so what we were interested in, what was left in architecture when you take out all the variables and you just think of architecture with the, what we call them, the invariance of architecture. This is where the title comes from. Think about structure. Architecture needs to hold up. Think about, the scale, the proportion to the body, movement, moving through space, relationship to light. This is all things. The light may vary, but all architecture will always have a relationship to natural light, for instance. So we tried to explore very intuitively with these concepts, but really try to create architecture from within. And this is where we started. And so we explored for many months, like just playing with form, having the kind of ambition to do larger projects, but at the same time didn't have any of these opportunities, so we were creating our own opportunity. And so we would like use two things that were really important for us at that time, like using geometry as, you know, one of the driver that was remaining, because we didn't have all the other variables. So we would use geometry, like for instance, like a random set of points, and then play very intuitively with grids and subgrids and trying to put them in 3D. So there was geometry, but there was also another type of constraint, not constraint, but of constant, that were the archetypes. Like these, and when we talk about concept, these are like the generalized ideas that are common to so much of the architecture. So we would use these figures like the arch or the dome or the pitch roof to try to generate ideas about architecture. So it was really like a very intuitive play with forms, and we generated 9 of those different forms, and I'm just going to go through really quickly because there's tons of images and diagrams of geometry, etc. But you can see that it's very abstract. It's often about geometry and form and repetitions and systems, but it always looks like architecture. You can recognize that it's holding up, that there is structure, that there is rhythm, that there are cells, and you know, exploration on different types of structures. And so we did a kind of a series of booklets and exhibitions. So it was really a project that occupied a lot of our first years. In the meantime, we also were interested to build, not being only in the realms of concept, but try to look at the other complete opposite side of the cursor, just having clients, budget, context, and operating also in the actual built context of Montreal. So because when you're a young architect, you don't even, most of the time, don't even get to build a new house. You get to, you know, swap the kitchen for the bathroom, or as you can see here, just do a roof access. So we would do a lot of these projects. So basically the project is just this deck and little box, but we were trying to apply these ideas of having these coherent objects, just like in variation, but they were really grounded with the build fabric and all the constraints that we had to deal with. And it was a really intense phase of experimentation with the confrontation of concept and context. And some of them were more successful, some of them were, when we look back at them, a little bit less enmeshed than what we like to, or what maybe we are able to do today. But we did a lot of them, and I think it was a really interesting way to understand how to confront these idealistic concepts. We work with, you know, very simple geometric forms with the actual complexity of the site. So some of them, I put plans because, you know, in the end, the more we advance, I think the more these kind of pure boxes, because we look back at them and it's really a family of small articulated boxes, the more they would start to get enmeshed also with, like, retaining their formal rigor, but starting to really weave a relationship with the host. Like in this project, for instance, it really went, like, try to align the windows and take some cues about the chromatic palette of the house. And so experimenting with these relationships, the box with the landscape, or some kind of materiality. So we were doing both these projects in variation and all these additions project, like both dreaming of having this kind of open field in front of us to do these absolute concept that we were dreaming of, but also confronting this. And I think we learned a lot about this confrontation with the context.
So we recently went through the process of rebuilding our website, and it forced us to revisit our portfolio and also take the time to consider and better define our work and attitude towards building. And this notion of the project existing within the tension between the autonomous concepts of architecture and the specificities of the program and the site was really a fundamental aspect to this exercise. And so we thought it'd be interesting to try and explain this idea through a short, mostly chronological presentation of our work. But before we begin, I want to take a little moment to just go through a short description of this idea that we've just presented to you. So we tried to summarize this idea. Designs are developed by navigating the tension between the internal and external forces of the project. On the one hand, the studio approaches architecture as an autonomous system and works with geometric systems, typological and historical models and references. And on the other hand, there's the conviction that the project specificities are always generative. The intersection between these two perspectives produces architectural objects that are clear and rigorous, but always contextual. Rather than developing a specific style or a predefined formal language, the studio's approach is based on the principle that different conditions produce different expressions. Projects are conceived by postponing the vision of a finished product for as long as possible, placing instead trust in the creative process as the generator of architecture that is ideally always distinctive. So this feedback loop between top-down conceptual objects and bottom-up emergent forces produces what we describe as relational objects, an architecture that forms intricate bonds with its site and program while retaining an unmitigated conceptual clarity and object-like quality. So the first project we're going to show you to deep dive kind of in this complex relationship and trying to highlight these tensions and where they can be very generative is the Insectarium. And this is the first major competition that we won while we were doing both in variations and working on these small additions and homes and other types of typical startup projects. We were also doing regular competitions. And there was an international competition, I think in 2014 or 15, for 3 institutions at the Espace pour la Vie, which is the site that encompasses the Botanical Garden in Montreal, but also the planetarium, the Biodome, and now the Biosphere. And they asked for an insectarium, a new insectarium that was on the same site of the existing insectarium, which is a museum inside the Botanical Garden. The 2 other projects were a exhibition greenhouse for multi-purpose events, and the third one was the Biodome, who architects Canva in Montreal realized a year or 2 before we realized the Insectarium. So it was a 2-stage competition, and we won the competition with a Berlin firm called Kunmavetsi, who are specialized in museum design and also museology. So they have this double role as both architects, but also scenographers or museologists. So what was fascinating about the Insectarium was the brief. And the brief asked, first of all, the brief was produced by the in-house team of scientists, entomologists, and and museologists of the insectarium from Espace pour la Vie. And it was extremely specific. And where we're so accustomed now to these somewhat generic briefs, this one was opinionated, and it had a very, very clear idea of how to guide visitors through this museum experience and discovering the world of insects. They even proposed a specific sequence, but they didn't give any hints as to how to give form to this. All we had was an existing building and a specific site inside a botanical garden, and a series of themes and questions to address. And there seemed like there were two choices for the architecture for our proposition. One was to create somewhat of a generic architecture or generic box, typically maybe a white or black box depending on what was needed, and then to let the scenography or the scenographers do their own exhibition inside of this, which is, I would say, 90% of what we see in museum design these days. The second option was to embrace the heterogeneity of the brief, which included so many different ideas and vision with no real concern for coherence. You know, the clients didn't ask us, or I should rather say, didn't think of how to bring this together. They really said, these are the important themes to address. And so the second idea was to really embrace this very heterogeneous approach and to define each one of the moments with their own specific needs, forms, materiality, and to really try and bring them together in a second phase into a coherent whole. So our approach in the end was to interpret the client's brief and narrative in a very literal way. So we read and reread the brief, and we started giving each of the elements that we can see here, which started with the labyrinth, which we called also the reset moment, a series of alcoves, these head-to-head meetings, a collection of naturalized insects, another reset moment that brought us to a great vivarium, a creative workshop space, and back out into the botanical garden. And the brief also asked us to think of the museum outside of the building boundaries and to go way beyond the doors of the museum. So we then started creating a sequence, a formal sequence with all these moments. And it created this extremely complex and unusual form that we can see here, three-dimensional, multi-layered, and it became extremely complex, especially when placed in a sequence. So the next question was, how do we bring this collage together into a coherent whole? And because the museum was placed inside a greenhouse, we knew, inside a botanical garden, we knew that we didn't want to bring in a new architectural typology. And we wanted to avoid to create this out-of-place museum. So the only component of the program that I mentioned earlier that required both natural light and a connection with the outside was the butterfly garden and the plant production areas. The rest of the museum was essentially, like I mentioned earlier, could have been in black boxes or white boxes completely detached from the outside. So it felt extremely logical and natural to work exclusively with the typology of the greenhouse. So just this glass box, there was an adjacent production greenhouse directly next to the site. And to keep the rest of the program essentially underground and hidden and with no direct contact with the outside. So we use this greenhouse as an overarching form. So what we can see here is really this kind of stepped, single-pitched greenhouse form, which included within it both the production areas, the laboratories, the actual visitor greenhouse, with the one exception, which was the dome, which was the collection space, which is another very strong archetypal form, which works almost in complete opposition with the greenhouse. It's entirely opaque and dense. It's a very organic form, unlike the greenhouse, which is a very technical and pragmatic form. So in the site, we wanted essentially the building to kind of disappear, but it also be extremely clear and bold in its intent. So this is a site view where we showed the steep or the sloping greenhouses, the dome, which is also a vegetated dome, which is essentially completely wrapped in a metal mesh, and over the years will start growing and becoming almost this kind of chia pet. And so the idea was to really have something that was both extremely in its place with the glass house, that was both discreet, but also bold and clear and coherent. So just before the museum opened and before they started planting the gardens, this is what the museum looked like in the winter. So we can see the dome on the left with its wire frame and the greenhouse itself. And so we enter the museum by gradually sloping down this butterfly garden that we proposed, which is essentially dug into the botanical garden site, sloping down about 5 meters. And the botanical garden is extremely flat, and this creates this kind of first reset where we suddenly lose contact with the horizon and become more in touch with the facades of the building. A view from the botanical garden where we can see this very typical greenhouse architecture. The opposite side where we see the laboratories, where there's essentially a single architectural language, which is these glass facades. Another view where we see the sloping garden slowly reaching down towards the main entrance hall. Also note that in the sequence, the entrance to the insectarium happens here, not inside the building. And so the exhibition, the butterflies, depending on the season, and even the animators can be outside and greet you outside. And this is also where you end your museum visit. And something that's very important in a lot of our work is to put the emphasis where the emphasis needs to be put. And in this case, the lobby was not where we wanted to put the emphasis. So essentially, the lobby is this very simple, almost industrial-like greenhouse architecture where we have essentially this panoramic view, well, not panoramic, but this horizontal view of this butterfly garden from which we arrived. And where we can already feel the presence of the greenhouse above us. But right here on the left, we can see where there's a little butterfly. There's one sliver in this lobby where the museum experience starts. And so visitors are all timed. The visits are essentially almost like a parkour. Start the museum experience by going through this reset, essentially this almost kind of dark, slightly labyrinth-like descent into this world of grottos. And the point was to really create this feeling of losing your relation to your outside world. So losing your sense of sight and your sense of space and horizontality, and everything is either sloped or curved, very few sources of light. And so you meander through these passages, and eventually you arrive in the grottos, where there's a series of 9 experiments or 9 experiences, all telling us something about the world of insects, whether it be sight or whether it be movement, whether it be form, whether it be X-ray vision. So vibration. So there were 9 autonomous grottos, which each one allowed you to move freely. This is one of the only moments in the museum experience where you're not entirely guided. And after this first very abstract and conceptual encounter with the world of insects, we then go into what we call the tête-à-tête, so a first head-to-head encounter with insects. And this is a small moment where we have 4 different little displays where we see our first living insects, which are also displayed on the wall through a series of video presentations and these kind of blown up contacts with insects. After the tête-à-tête, we go back into a series of ramps, but here we see the juxtaposition of the grotto and this natural earth concrete that we developed with the greenhouse architecture, with the metal ceiling that we see here. And we arrive in the collection dome, which is essentially a series of vitrines, all organized according to color and typology, in a very kind of classic shape, essentially this almost cathedral-like display, where visitors are really brought into the world of naturalized insects through their physical and visual qualities. And there's a series of apps, and there's a team of entomologists who can help you, guide you if you're interested in diving deeper into any of the species. So following the dome, we go back into this grotto-like ramp and labyrinth, and we rise up, and we finally emerge outside of the ground, and we get in contact with the immersive greenhouse, and suddenly everything changes. The light changes, the temperature changes, the smell becomes omnipresent, and in this great vivarium, suddenly we're in this very kind of lush and very free, organic space where essentially butterflies and other insects, ants and spiders and snails roam free. And this vivarium is essentially the first moment where we are not told a specific story, but we get to really intuitively exchange with the insects. And it's also the first moment where we gain this new perspective on where we are inside the botanical garden. As we can see through the mesh, through the netting, we can see the garden outside. We can even see the mast of the Olympic Stadium not too far. So suddenly we take consciousness of where we are in the city. And then we re-exit through the same butterfly garden that we entered, sloping back up towards the botanical garden entrance, which brings me as a segue into the following project, which is the garden pavilion, which serves as this kind of meeting point and ticketing office for all the different institutions of Espace pour la Vie, and an entrance point for the eastern entrance of the botanical garden. So we can see here in black the insectarium, the footprint of the insectarium with the garden. And as I mentioned earlier, we had thought of the thought of the insectarium within a much greater realm of the botanical garden and Espace pour la Vie institutions. And so when we were asked to come up with the entrance pavilion, we knew that we didn't want to be in continuity with the insectarium. It really didn't have anything to do, but we knew we wanted to create a similar link to nature and a similar link to the topic, which in this case was the botanical garden. So here we see the site plan of the pavilion on the top right. as well as a small little box on the bottom, which is the ticketing booth. And the idea for this pavilion was to create a pavilion that wasn't static, that allowed us to really move freely and guide us through the different institutions of the botanical garden. And we quickly identified the triangle, the equilateral triangle, as a form that had these qualities of being both very frontal, but also less static, so than a square, for example. So by positioning it the way we did, it allowed to be at once addressing the entrance to the botanical garden and the entrance to the insectarium, but as well the exit, because the flows of people were extremely complex in this area, because some people started their visit at one end of the botanical garden and ended it at another end. So the idea was to create something where we could naturally flow in and out of the pavilion and have it feel less like a building and more just like a hub or this kind of meeting spot. And then we worked with a square overhanging roof to create this, essentially this framework for the triangle to really express itself, which also created these gathering spaces that were protected from the rain and from the snow, but essentially that really allowed to give recognize the triangle as a shape. So we can see here in plan, and inside the triangle we worked with 3 other little triangles to really define the corners and express the geometry, the pure geometry. The other question that we were really interested in for the pavilion at the Botanical Garden was the question of the role of the pavilion and the typology of the pavilion historically. And we were very interested at different representations of these 18th century and 19th century ruin-like pavilions to understand the relationship between nature and architecture, and almost in this very kind of romantic way. And we wanted the pavilion to be less of a building and, again, more of a shelter or a meeting point and a threshold. The other idea that we looked at was the idea of the materiality. And we quickly identified corten as this unique material that allowed the building to not be static and to be more at one with nature and with its context, to change, to evolve. But then we also wondered, well, how can we modify this material so that it's even less static, even less clear? And what's interesting with corten is that it very slowly changes by the oxidization process, but it also very much changes with the climate, the light, and also the adjacent vegetation, which can have an impact on it. So we thought, why not amplify this contamination, let's say, and work with this expanded. This building has the same materiality, but in a very different expression, but work with this expanded metal mesh that could become a sort of kind of support to nature, this kind of anchor. This is a few weeks or months after vines were planted, and already the vines were creeping up and finding their home. A few photos just to show the pavilion in its context. Here I think we can really see this expression of the triangle within the square. And what's interesting also with the corten is from a distance it actually looks quite dense and opaque because of its color and the backdrop, the black backdrop. But once you get closer, you really feel the texture and the variety and the way it catches light. And we went, and this is maybe the exercise that we often do when we look at these very abstract concepts, is how can we push this to the extreme almost? How can we push this as far as possible? So we decided to use nothing but corten essentially for all the walls, the ceilings, and just other than the furniture, and really just kind of have it feel more outside than inside, and really amplify this connection with the garden landscape. Really quickly, just the same here with the small ticketing office. In this case, a square within a rectangle.
So we are interested in many programs. I think we really are architects that don't want to specialize, that are actually really worried about the idea that we would become specialists of like any typology, because I think when we did the insectarium, there was one magical thing that was, one opportunity that was there, is that there was no precedent for insectarium. And I think it was really interesting, this idea that you don't have a clue what an insectarium should look like and how it's built and how it's supposed to be. So you're really left like with just thinking first principle, and I think that's what we try to do with the insectarium. And I think this, you lose this when you do program after program, like always the same kind of typology. I think you lose, I think the naivety of doing things for the first time is always really good. So, so we have a very large array of program we are tackling, and this is something that we really like. So there was this opportunity in Quebec like a few years ago. Schools were done by the same 4 or 5 firms, because every time there was a school going for bid, you had to show how many, like 2, 3 schools already built, and this kind of gateway to sort of protected gateway to public commission was really problematic. But there was a series of competitions that were organized by an organism called the Labécole, because this was becoming really a problem, and schools were not able to, you know, get in sync with the moment. Like everyone was asking, like, why can't we build school with wood, for instance? And you know, wood was becoming really an important building material, but schools were continuing to be built in like concrete blocks and just like the traditional way. And so they did this series of competition called the Labécole. And interestingly, almost none of the firms that, well, none of the firms that usually were doing school won any of those 5 competitions. And it's mostly people that never did school before that won the competition. So we did, there was 5 competition, we did 3, we won 1, and this is one of the projects I'm going to present. So the idea for this project, there was in the brief again, a little bit the seeds of this project. We're asking for a series of pavilions that were to be organized by age group. So every kid would kind of recognize the school, like their place in the school. Like the school would not be this undifferentiated building, but they could see their progress in time through the different pavilions. And they were also asking for a courtyard. But they were, in the brief, they were talking about a school on 2 floors, and this is where we kind of deviate from the brief, and I think it's one of the things that made us won this competition, is that we've put everything on 1 floor in different pavilions, and occupying all this floor space, we could really embrace the courtyard and create this courtyard that becomes the art of the school. And this is what you see in this diagram. There's a series of pavilions. So the one like going counterclockwise counterclockwise from the right. There is really the small kids pavilion with the kindergarten and first cycle. Then there is like a common on top, common pavilion with all the cafeteria, the large area with where the groups can be addressed in the school administration. Then the third pavilion counterclockwise is the gymnasium, and then cycles 2 and 3. So we've put like different functions, organized these functions in a kind of a group form, but at the same time, it was important, just like the insectarium where we had like this kind of heterogeneous programs, it was important for us to group them in a formal system that would not make like just a collection of objects, but a variation on one theme. So the form is very articulated, but it's also a repetition of different, of the same kind of form. And it's something that we have had explored a few years prior with this small, this house out in the country. It was a house where the brief was about these families that were recomposed, and so there was the house of the kids, there was the house of the parents, and there was the common house. And the brief was really interesting in the sense that there was 3 houses, so we literally did 3 houses, but again, it was the same form, same proportions, articulated, rotated, expressed in space, and creating these kind of complex organization internally, but creating still this coherence that is really important for us. So we see a little bit I don't know if I cannot point with my, but you see a little bit what I've talked about. So even if the gym is something that is completely different in terms of height, in terms of scale, it has the same more or less the same expression of the other pavilion, and we achieve that by sinking the gym like half a floor down. So when the kids cross the gym to go to the cafeteria, for instance, that is on the top, they can see the other kids play like one story below. But just this moves was allowing us to create this, again, like keep this uniformity, this kind of horizontality that you will see that you see there. So the gym is not like 2 floors and the rest is 1 floor. So I think this is a kind of important thing where the relationship with the program, you kind of use the program to articulate and to generate the rules of the organization of the school. But at the same time, the formal system is also very important to keep coherent. And in the way, the sinking of the gym was a really important gesture for us. So you see a little bit some of the section we did at the time of the competition, trying to use these space, because in terms of context, there was a lot of agrarian building, pitch roof building, like large kind of agrarian building in the area. So we also worked with this idea of the archetype. That is another constant in our work, and it was the question then was like how we can use the archetype of the pitch roof, how we can use it spatially, and we'll see like in a few moments in the image. So very beautiful context with Mont Shepherd, and I didn't say it when we had the plan, but basically the courtyard is a sea open, like exactly calibrated to frame the top of the Mount Shepherd from the courtyard. So it becomes like this is part of architecture that is outside. It's looking for parameters to organize this courtyard. The view was one that regulated the formal system. So this is the entrance, and you will see these kind of large chimney that is also a reference of vernacular buildings around. But these are light wells that brings light into the group of each group of 4 classroom. we'll see the interior. So this is a very low building. The context was very, very horizontal outside the Mount Shepherd, which is kind of an accident in the landscape. Everything around is very, very flat, very horizontal. So we thought the building should just hang low in the landscape and leave the mountain express itself the more we can. This is from the interior of the courtyard. So you see this horizontal line, I think for us was really important as a kind of a link between all the pavilions. So it's a covered walkway. So when it's raining, for instance, the kids can shelter under the cantilevers. The cantilevers are between 2 and 3 meters deep, so very, very deep. It also acts as a sun shading device for the classroom. And you have the framing of the mountain in the back with this articulation of the different pavilion. And the courtyard is really where you enter in the morning, where you do recess, when you leave at night. This is really the entry point of the school, and the other side is really like for the formal entrance. So the kids are really coming from all around the area, like in this courtyard. And so this is one. So every group of 4 class, it was one important innovation in the program, is that this idea that you don't learn only in class. You want to create a school that has different opportunities for learning, different opportunities to teach. So the classrooms are a little bit smaller, and there was a certain kind of generosity in the program, like additional square meters to do these shared space between a group of 4 classrooms, where the teacher can bring the kids outside, they can sit on the bleachers, they can work on some working table, and they can go into this little nook, this little mezzanine that we created, because we had this pitch roof that was at the beginning more of a kind of a nod to the agrarian buildings around, but then we really looked at the opportunities, the spatial opportunities that were created, and we really wanted to have a kind of a simple building outside, but a very complex interior, because I think for kids, they're going to spend 7 years in this school, and they should have like a complex space, where they can be in like small space, big space, like having a view outside, having no view outside. It's in a slope, and all those spaces I think are not really visually so playful, but I think in terms of space, they can be appropriated in many different ways, and I think this complexity was really important for us. You also see the wood structure. That was, one of the reasons why we separated the building into 4, well, technically 5, but 4 different pavilions in terms of code, is that it was allowing us to have wood structure exposed. So the buildings are considered separate buildings because they have like a separate passageway that is like fireproof, and this allowed us to do exposed wood structure without sprinklers. And this was a really interesting use of the code to kind of use it as our own way of wiggling around the rules, and to be able to do an exposed structure that would be really pure. So different pavilion, different kind of mezzanine, but every pavilion has a little bleacher and a mezzanine to go and have read a book on a beanbag under the roof. So this is the main bleacher. This is where all the kids gather. So again, the same kind of typology, very open onto the courtyard. You can actually open large sliding doors and go inside and outside, and on the top there is this little space. relationship to the forest. And the view, so this is at the end of one of the mezzanine. There's this oculus that is on the pitch roof that frames the Mount Shepherd. Of course, we like to do museum. We want, I was talking about tackling different programs, and we like that, but we really like the museum also, you know, as a public space and as a space of reflection. So we did this competition, last competition, but we are doing now the permanent exhibition in the building that we lost the competition, but we just thought that we would put our ego on the side and just do the just do the exhibition. It was still nice, a nice project to do, but we just wanted to show you the competition for that. So it was an open competition, first phase, open competition, international open competition, and 4 finalists. And again, we were interested, we were trying to find what was the figure that was going to be the instantly recognizable, I would not say symbol, but form of the museum. And we were thinking about we wanted to anchor this in one programmatic element, and this is the garden. There was one element of the program that was really important in the brief. It was going to be a garden. I think in the brief it was intended as a garden that you can go after entering the building, having your ticket paid, more like a controlled private garden. But we thought that it would be really interesting to actually put it as, you know, a relationship to the city. So as this shared space. So the front of the museum would be this gift to the city, or this place where communities can meet and have people that are totally, maybe even totally uninterested in visiting the Holocaust Museum, but still would go there to spend time in the garden or grab a coffee and spend time there. And hopefully there would be like meetings and encounter, or they would see celebration from the Jewish community that would use this garden, but in a much more public way. So we wanted to both address the street and take a step back for the museum and create this buffer space between the city, the street, the sidewalk, and the museum. And we had this whole idea of the thresholds, because going to see an exhibition on the Holocaust, you need to pass some threshold and prepare yourself for what you're going to see. And we really saw this as one series of threshold that you were crossing. So it was calling for the series of screen. And I'm going to talk about the materiality a little bit later. But you see it in sections. So it was basically not really like an articulated form. It was really the figures of the screen, the flat 2D screens, and thresholds that you cross and you get into the exhibition. So you see it like from the street. There's this elevated part of the facade that is as high as the building on each side, which are 2-story buildings, and there used to be 2-story buildings there. So it was a bit of a relationship with the context, and then set back behind this kind of green screen of greenery that was participating in this kind of layering, you would have the screen of the building. So you see it a little bit in context, this idea of that we would shift all the museum, not put it in the front as a really imposing and, you know, kind of a strong monumental statement on the street, but maybe just a little setback. So you see the garden, the hall, and then the exhibition space in behind. So this is really a project that is layered from the front to the back. And when we're talking about this screen, we were interested in thinking what we're going to interested in creating this a kind of intentionality with the screen, because they would be like so minimal, and that they had to add this kind of intense materiality to create something interesting in the city, the play with light. And we looked at this memorial from Louis Kahn, unbuilt memorial for the 6 million murdered Jews. And it was like a series of spaces created with glass blocks. And he had this whole discussion about, light as not using heavy concrete, for instance, to kind of symbolize the weight of history, but create a interplay of light and shadow, because you always can see this event as a relationship between, light and dark, and hope and despair. So it was a really important precedent. And the other idea was to use this idea of the healing. So on the left, this is an image from Kristallnacht, in one of, probably like historians tend to agree that this is the founding moment of what was going to happen next. The first moment where the society would allow violence against its own member, like there was a license from the government to actually use violence against some member of the society. So Kristallnacht, probably everyone is more or less familiar with it, but all the windows of the Jewish communities, from the houses, the shops, the synagogues, were broken into this night, and there was a lot of beating and murder too. And so there's all the shards. The Kristallnacht is the night of crystal, because there was glass everywhere in the city, on the street. And we thought that this would be an interesting figure to use as a symbol for the materiality of the project, but to use it not only in a negative way, but also in a positive way, this idea of the healing. So we used recycled glass. So the glass shards are recycled. Glass shards are actually baked again together and fused together to create this really heavy and strong material. And it creates this really beautiful textured glass through which the light really go through, and there's an interplay of light. But it was this idea that we would put this recomposed glass on the same street, commercial street where the Jews first arrived in Montreal, which is on Saint Laurent, as a gesture of also healing and showing that they are back on the street, on the facade in the street. And so we have this plane that we talked a bit earlier as this buffer zone between the exhibition space and the exterior. And the memorial garden in the back. So again, another, like in this section, there is this long monolith onto which you put a stone before leaving the exhibition.
Another project that we recently won 2 years ago following an international competition in Montreal called Phi Contemporary. So there's an existing institution in Montreal called Phi Center, which launched this competition to bring together in one place all the diffusion spaces, or all the exhibition spaces and presentation spaces related to Phi. So both visual arts, but also music and performance art. What was extremely particular about this brief in this competition was the extremely complex site and existing buildings on the site. It's in Old Montreal, and it's essentially located in one of the oldest first settlements of the city, on the intersection of Rue Saint-Paul and Rue Bon Secours, next to La Chapelle Bon Secours et le Marché Bon Secours. And the little house that we see on the right is located exactly on the footprint of the first house that was built in Montreal. The structure that's there now is now a stone structure, dates back to about 1776, which is called Maison du Calvet. But so the PHI team decided, which is already in Old Montreal, meaning all their buildings and their institutions, DHC Art, now called the Foundation, and the PHI Center, are already located in Old Montreal. So it was extremely important for them to stay in this neighborhood, to create this sense of community, and in a neighborhood that's somewhat, that feels sometimes a little disconnected from the city and more oriented towards tourists. And this kind of pastiche representation of what les premières, la Nouvelle France was. But for PHI's team, it was extremely important to create a museum that was deeply anchored in its site, which is very atypical for a museum when we think about how museums tend to build their exhibition spaces now. Again, coming back to this idea of white boxes and black boxes, which are, like the room we are in, the most common and agreed upon ways to present art and performance. But in this case, what the brief asked for was to, yes, develop a series of performance spaces with specific design criterias, but to blend them within what they called a centralized and decentralized series of spaces. And what they meant by centralized and decentralized is to be able to kind of present art not just in these spaces, but also in other types of spaces, and in between spaces, or in outdoor spaces, or in the city, in the cityscape itself. So what we're showing here is how we chose to address the site in its purest form. Again, coming back to this idea of these extremely abstract concepts. And there were so many questions that are too long to get into now, but like, how do we infill? How do we combine old and new? Or how do we add to existing structures, some of which have already been transformed numerous times? And our thought process was first to really take a step back, and similarly to the Holocaust Museum that Hubert just presented, where we wanted to literally take this step back. Here too, we wanted to basically try and erase our edition, or create this almost non-architecture, and create more of a backdrop for artists and curators and citizens to take possession of this art institution. And so we can see here this horizontal band and how it comes together in built form. So the idea here was to really create this plateau, essentially this new plane that served both as this reference point for the museum. It contained, obviously, the art spaces, but it also offered a very unique reading of the existing structures. So again, not trying to add to them, but really trying to kind of frame them and hold them together in a way, by adding also a series of public spaces. So here we can see on the left, we're at grade with the streets, whereas the plateau kind of hovers above the street level and creates this new entrance along Rue Bon Secours. We can also see that on top of the plateau, there's a vegetated garden space where the public is invited to come, whether it be through the museum or independently from the museum within the framework of the museum hours and programming. So there was also this idea of the vitrine. How can we create something that's in a way is kind of almost a a vitrine and a showcase of the artists, and not this precious box or piece of architecture that people then go into to see another precious art piece or another artist. In this case, I think we really wanted to be as subdued, or not subdued, as humble as possible, and to work with the most common materials and stay within this kind of mineral realm of the stone and glass of the original buildings. Going inside, what we wanted to do is to really create a variety of spaces, especially within the existing buildings, which tend to have very, very small rooms and low ceilings. And so we used one of the buildings, the Maison Vigée, which was the third structure erected on site, I think in 1810, and to essentially hollow it out and to use it as this new entrance hall for the museum that connected to the historical courtyards in the back, which is what we see here at the back of the bleachers. And these rear courtyards were more interesting in a way than the buildings themselves, because this is where the program, this is where throughout the 250 years that the houses were used, evolved and changed the most. They were workshops for statues for a long time, back of houses for shops and for houses, carriage houses, and they evolved and changed. Even sometimes they were used by the neighboring buildings and not by not by the buildings on our site. And so these rear courtyards were extremely important, and we wanted to create this almost I'm going to go to this side. This almost kind of undifferentiated parcours through the site, which echoed this history of these rear courtyards and annex buildings. So again, Hubert used the word earlier, as I said, extremely complex, and we see this as being a very positive thing, to have these surprising, often somewhat maybe even confusing, but full of variety and full of personality. These projects that essentially can't be summed up by one thing, but also which can be read in a very coherent and homogeneous way, and can be understood in an abstract way with often this single gesture. So here we see somewhat of an impossible view from the back end of the site, where we show kind of all the features, where we can see the courtyard, the existing courtyard on the bottom with the art piece. We can see the auditorium, which also acts when it's not used, like this space in auditorium setting, as a gathering space, but also a circulation space, the education space adjacent to it, and the direct access to the rooftop terrace. And then back into the building through this greenhouse structure above one of the existing buildings whose roof had been destroyed maybe 50 years ago, and which we're proposing to rebuild as more of a mono-pitched or single-pitched greenhouse structure. The project is very much in motion, and we're deep in planning phase right now, and starting to move towards permitting. So a lot of this has already evolved, but the main aspects of the project are still very much intact. So the plateau, and this is extremely important in our approach, is to really believe in these strong concepts, and to really push their feasibility in a way, and to really go to the kind of extreme. And in this case, there were so many reasons why this plateau could have been removed from the project, but it felt like Hubert mentioned something at the beginning of the project that's extremely important to us, but that felt extremely generous, surprising, different, and public, and it gave this not only great house or great venue for artists to show their work, but also a great space and place for citizens to see the city in a different way. So in this case, being almost in the roofscape of Old Montreal is a quite unique feature, especially on such an expansive terrace. And you know, I could go on, but I think it's we've already talked quite a bit. But a lot of work was done regarding the materiality of the project, working with natural stone for the gravel of the roof, or I should say for the stabilized earth of the roof, and using very specific types of trees and vegetation. So to arrive at this kind of still very pure reading of the original concept as this horizontal plateau. Quick view inside the original house, Maison Vigée, where we can really see the connections with the existing houses on the right, and where we can see also all the traces, the historical traces of the buildings and how they were transformed over time. Maybe just a quick note about this view that I already showed. This is the new iteration of it, which shows how similar it is, but with a few modifications, but where we, if anything, amplified this notion of transparency in the vitrine and this invitation inside. But one thing that we want to mention to you about this view is that we live in a world where we are capable of doing such real representation of projects that sometimes we forget to come back to this abstract view. And while this is a very photorealistic render, this is a completely impossible view. And so when we did the competition and we were working with our partners, a lot of people were telling us this is a very bad idea to show an image of a building where we're essentially a block behind the neighboring building. We're not, this is a view we will never have, but we felt as though it was important to keep this kind of object-like or model-like reading of the project so that we can keep using our imagination. And we also, you know, in these lectures, we don't have a chance to really dive into our work method, but this is also why we love models so much. And for this project, we worked with a physical model way before we did any renders that was, I think, 3 meters long by 2 meters wide. It was really like a train model. And this is very similar to that. It's a view where you are capable of really working together. And what we like about these models is that everybody can gather around and have a discussion, and it's not just one person with the computer that's holding the mouse in front of the computer. Hi, Buzzy. Yeah, we got to speed up. So, very quickly, and this is a small project, so we should be able to go through it very quickly. This is a house in the Laurentians outside Montreal, very close. The brief was very simple. They said we wanted a cabin or a house, but not a house, more of a cabin in the trees. And the land had already many mostly mid-century, but modern structures. Each one very, very simple and yet bold and recognizable. And the clients asked us to come up with a new version of these small houses in a site which was extremely pitched, so over 30 degree slope, which was perfect for a house in the trees. And we were also confronted with these very specific bylaws, the main one being that we couldn't build on stilts. So how do you do a house on trees when you can't really go up and without having a massive footprint? And so we worked really hard with the bylaws to come up with the most simple structure that could be at once very easy to use and very easy to live, but which could help us live inside the trees. So what we did is we cantilevered a 9-square grid box, which I'll get back to in 2 seconds, on this very small plinth, concrete plinth. The bylaws allowed for a 2.5-meter cantilever. Didn't say how many, so we just applied it on all sides. And the zonage office looked at us a little confused and said, I guess it works. Yeah. And then we applied this very, very simple 9-square grid and this regular grid of windows, so 9 cells, other than the entrance side, which is very opaque. And I'll come back to the ramp in a second. To create a house. And as we can see in this plan, not every room in a house deserves the same size. So it was an exercise in really kind of finding the limits of where using such a rigid grid becomes more of an opportunity or something original for the house than a constraint. And it turned out to be quite not easy, but quite interesting and not that hard. And so everything from the terrace, the screened-in porch, which is on the left there, everything fit into the system without too much effort. So it's a three-room house. There's a room in the basement. And on the roof, to be even more in the trees, we're offering this large deck with this passerelle that reaches up to it. So on all 4 sides, the house kind of floats in its setting. And it's a similar diagram when we think about it to Phi, but it's not historical buildings that we're trying to frame here, but it's more the nature in which the house is set. But each side offered a very different view, to very different angles, and yet with a completely homogeneous facade system. Little glimpse here of the structure is essentially a steel structure, very, very simple, that we can see here, plateau. And then a fully wood, so we see the concrete plinth, the steel structure overhang, and above it, it's a full wood structure, not an ounce of steel, not the windows, no aluminum, no nothing. It's 100% wood, mass timber, and shingles. So again, I'll keep it short, but pushing this idea of going all out with one material, with one expression, no exceptions. And a very, very clear reading. So we're showing, instead of showing renders, we're showing very fresh, recent photographs of the site. Last project, 2 minutes.
Yeah, so I think I was intended to talk a little bit more, but I think I can do it in like 30 seconds, just to say that we are collecting, we have been doing houses for a really long time, collecting plans that we are interested in that have special quality. So it became a project through time. We call it, we don't have a name yet, even if we've been working on this project for a very long time. Names are the artists. So we called it effectively, like with affection, perfect plan. But it's a collection of different kinds of plans of single family houses that we assembled through time. Each one have very special formal quality, these qualities that we've been talking about. Like all these plans confront this kind of idealized form or structure or organization with the program of a single family house. So we've spent a lot of time analyzing them, classifying them, understanding them. It become this kind of repertoire of different typologies, and I'm going really fast, but you'll see we'll come back to this. And because we just presented Wiseboard with the 9-square grid plan, that is, something that goes really deep into the history of architecture, goes back all the way to Palladio, and I think our work start from the site or start from the constraint of start from the program, then we go back into this conceptual realm and go back and dig with this material of the geometry and the history and the references, all things that are really important for us. And this is about this negotiation between these two ends of the spectrum, and I just hope that this like kind of feedback loops into the project that we just presented, like very abstract research, but somehow it feeds our practice. And I hope you enjoyed this little presentation, and I think we're going to open to questions now.
So our speakers just concluded on a note of constraint, and they have another constraint because when I was coming here, the restaurant called me and said they're closing the kitchen early. So I have to whisk them away for dinner, but I think they will take some questions. But maybe what we can do is just take a 30-second break for anyone who wants to exit, just to reduce the amount of noise, because I know this is a creaky room. So I just invite you if you want to hit the road, and otherwise I'll just wait maybe 20, 30 seconds, and then we'll open it up. They'll probably put you in the small corner.
This is when we evaluate whether we do good.
That's right. How many more boxes? I mean, I got the ultimate audible. Closing the kitchen at 45.
Where is this?
This is at a restaurant called Pelletier. It's very good.
Good.
Okay, folks, so I hadn't quite realized that the speakers have this horrible spotlight on them, so it's hard to see the audience. But we invite you to raise questions, and if you like, just project your voice, and we'll hear you. There's someone right here.
Hi, I loved your presentation so much. And I'm wondering, with your projects, do you tend to have like a lot of ideas at the start, and then you have to like cipher through them and like simplify them to your final, or do you find you usually start with just one idea and then you can add on details until you get to your final?
Yeah, very, very good question. We have a say at the office. We are like a money-burning machine in the early phase of the project. We branch out to every possible, obviously not every possible, but the most options we can, and we actually, really are nervous about closing doors. This is a thing that we are not really good to do, is close doors. So when we have a really good option, the first thing we do is put it aside and try to do the opposite. But I think, so it's really not so efficient in terms of creation, but I guess it's also one of the strengths that we have, is that we try to turn every stone. But I think of it as a kind of diagram of life. You have species that are fit to survive and that have longer branches that develop into different sub-options, and you have other options that die really quickly. But yeah, we do work with a lot of options. So it's, everything, when you present it, it looks tidy and really like strong conceptually, but it's something that sometimes takes time to emerge first, and sometimes we have like a really good idea, and then we realize that it's so in conflict with some aspect of the context or the brief that we cannot resolve this, that it's better to scrap this idea than to compromise it. So sometimes we just, like, even if there's less time to do the competition, we just do something else, because in the end, even if it looked like a good idea, it's better to not go there if it's going to be like a compromised version of it. So this is where this interplay of what has to bend to what. Sometimes we will put more square meters than required in the program into a room just because this room needs to be this big to fit in the concept or the organization. But sometimes it really doesn't work to fit an auditorium in this system. So we need to do something else conceptually, and it's better to scrap it and start again than to just try to fit a square thing into a round hole. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I would also say that we trust that when we explore for any project, whether it's private or public, that we'll be able to reuse the ideas that we explore on future projects. Not true on projects like the insectarium, because we haven't had other calls for insectariums, which is quite confusing, but yeah. Little note. Yes?
In your first beginning, which are the larger buildings rather than the residential, I got the impression, and I think you were saying it, outside and the inside are balanced. You don't want inside, but you want outside both to correlate. But in Montreal, like Ottawa, 6 months of the year, outside is, so have you found a trick or a methodology to keep the outside still for those, not 6 months, it's 4 months now.
That's a good question, and something that we're quite frustrated with oftentimes, especially when we compare with projects in Mexico and that famous relationship between inside and outside seems just so much easier over there. But I don't know that we have a specific answer to that, but I can say that like projects like the Insectarium and Phi are projects where I feel as though there were ways for us to really kind of go beyond the traditional notion of inside and outside. So the Insectarium, the main idea being the greenhouse, didn't really show in some of the images, but the connection is so strong even before you enter the building because it's a glass box. So you're already feeling this direct connection with the vegetation, not to mention that there's a garden inside the building. And then once you're inside, looking back. So, and Phi is similar. Phi is a building where the courtyards, the setbacks, the roofs, the greenhouse on the roof, there's just so many ways to create this relationship through, yes, windows are one way, but there are other ways, So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but it's definitely hard in our climate.
Yeah, so we did this, one of the last house, we presented this string of addition. The last one was a little white shoebox style house. We did an addition in the back, and I don't want to it back 1,000 times to get there, but there was a hole that was articulating the new part, the old part and the new part, and it was an inner courtyard in the middle of the house and a little passageway. And this courtyard, there's 2 sliding doors on each side. So in the summer, you can actually open both sliding doors and actually have this deck in the middle of the house, which is, super interesting, this inner courtyard. But in the winter, this fills with snow, and it's super beautiful because you have in the middle of the house, you have this bank of snow that you turn around. You might not open this sliding door as often as in the summer, but you still have this very interesting connection with outside in the middle of the building. So, yeah, sorry I don't have the picture, but trust my word, it's a nice experience. Yes.
Concerning the school, you did the project. You said the school were asking for 2-story high, and you went for 1-story high. Why did you change the number of story of the building?
We tried some version with 2 floors, and we couldn't embrace the site because we had not enough footprint. we couldn't create this courtyard that was really a space. It was just like separate buildings, and we were looking at, you know, things like universal accessibility. How do you create separate buildings when you need to have accessibility for everyone? It was a challenge. But I think it was mostly this idea that we couldn't really hold the space together with these blocks on 2 floors. So by just putting everything on one floor, we could really do this gesture and have, you know, an intimate courtyard that was bringing all the school together. So I think it was really about using the material that we had to create a different effect. And it's always a gamble when you decide if you're going to break the rules of the competition or not. Sometimes it's a winning gamble, sometimes it's really not. But you cannot know, and you try to read the mind of the jury, like going through the names and trying to understand if it's like a jury that would be open to other things. But yeah, we do that when we really believe it's better.
And we systematically regret it when we don't choose the, let's call it bold or unusual path, and we lose, because then it just feels like we were guided by conservatism.
Yeah, it's never really a good way to do a competition, to try to win it. Like, you have to do the competition like the best project you think is. Of course, there is like risk management, but sometimes when you try too much to do the project to win, it's usually not the best strategy, because someone is going to be a little bit more bold, and the proposal is going to stand out a little bit more.
I'll reserve the right to ask the last question. You know, as you were winding down and talking about the Phi Center, there was a sort of implicit statement about image making. You know, and we suddenly arrive in a moment where not only is the image pervasive, it can lie, for example, with AI, etc. And then you pivoted to the notion of the model. And you've suddenly told us, well, we made this enormous 3-meter by 2-meter model. And one can imagine that in your office, it's like a table, and people gather around and they talk and they move things.
Some people had to work from home.
Some people, no room left. So you evicted your employees.
Couldn't have happened if it wasn't for COVID.
Right. And you know, and something that I often say to students is that if you can make a model, you can build a building. You know, to me, there's a direct correlation in terms of material structure, et cetera. And I wonder if you could just talk very briefly about the model. You know, because a lot of the things that we saw in the images were a deep interest in typology, in figure ground, in axonometric. But I wonder if there's something that you could just tell us about, quote unquote, the model.
Well, I think this is a massive model. This is this big, a house, and burning money once again. But with cardboard, so no. But no, I mean, I think it's so true. First of all, it's one of the most collaborative ways to work. But also, what you said is just entirely true. If you can build a model, you can build the house, you know, and it's just repeating the same decision making at a different scale, and you can blow up this model to 1-1, you know, eventually, you know. So we also very much believe in mock-ups. So the insectarium was, I mean, again, we could have done the presentation just on the insectarium. So many layers, so many explorations, so many iterations. We didn't talk about that, but a question. You know, the first version of the insectarium is not at all what we showed you. It was not a coherent form but it did have, from the get-go, the series of different experiences that were eventually brought into this coherent form through the design process, and not the design, through the negotiation process that we've been talking about. I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I think the subjective perspective is important because it emulates your perception. But what was interesting in this image of phi, I think this image of phi acts a little bit like a model because you have an external point of view, a view that is not possible, and that relates more to the idea of the project. The idea is this long bar that brings everything together, that occupies the whole side, that links all the buildings. And so this is the idea, is the plateau, but it's stronger if you show it in elevation as this horizontal link and you see the street going down than if you look at it in perspective where all the lines, it doesn't express the plateau as strongly as the elevation. And this is what you have with the model. The models, you have this kind of distance, you have an external point of view. Of course, you can put your eye in it and have a subjective point of view, but it's more about the idea of the project than a perspective. And just like Yves said, I think what we really like about the model, we do a model like systematically at the beginning of any competition, is that everyone has a different point of view. We do foam models. Everyone can grab a piece of foam. We always have the foam cutter on the table. It's a collaborative and very democratic tool to create much more than the computer. And then we use the computer as well, of course, but this is more like a tool to create, like to actively design collaboratively. And in that sense, it's very important. And the last point I wanted to make about the phi model, we decided to do this huge model because they were asking for an animation. And with Pixar and all these super studios, anything that we would have done would have been so underwhelming. And because we are not animators, we are doing pretty good images, but it's always underwhelming. So we decided to take the opposite stance and to actually film this model. So we did this huge model because we wanted to be able to put the camera, even to put the camera in, like have camera movements. So if you go on the website of Phi, you can see the little movie that we did. And it's basically, it was both like a tool for design, and then at the end of the competition, like we filmed it to do this animation, and it had a different quality, like a very different quality than if we would have done an animation.
Yeah, and it brings back also the idea of abstraction, is that the model forces you to create an abstract reading or interpretation of the eventual building, because you can't get in all the
mullions.
The details, and that exercise is also very interesting and comes back to like what's the essence of it, sometimes we'll go extremely far in a conceptual approach, other times we won't. There's no perfect solution. It's really project-based. But the model is, again, like this really good tool to explore abstraction and communication, and concepts are communication, so it is communication exercise. So models are great.
Last year when we were thinking about this lecture series, Hubert, Yves, and I have a friend in common, and I asked him, he lives in Montreal, and I said, who's the finest office in Montreal? And in a heartbeat, he said Pelletier de Fontenay. And if they're the finest office in Montreal, ergo, perhaps one of the strongest offices in Canada. And I'm very delighted as a Montrealer to have this kind of hometown chauvinism. So please join me again in thanking them for coming to all of us.